Credit spreads. Investors expect to be paid to take risk, and a bond with a low credit rating is riskier than an identical bond with a higher credit rating. This is reflected in the bond's credit spread, which is the difference between the bond's yield and the yield of a low-risk benchmark, such as a Treasury. A below-grade junk bond, for example, will command a higher credit spread than a high-quality general obligation municipal bond. Because bond yields are constantly changing, so are their spreads. Credit spreads can widen, meaning that the yield difference between a bond and its benchmark increases. Spreads widen during contractionary periods of the business cycle and narrow during periods of expansion. In prosperous times, businesses thrive, and the risk of default among even the lowest-rated bonds is perceived to be small. High demand for junk bonds drives up their purchase price and drives down their yields relative to other, higher-rated bonds. In a weak market environment, the opposite occurs. Junk bonds no longer look so attractive. Borrowers must offer increasingly higher interest rates to attract investors. With respect to the business cycle, credit spreads tend to widen just before an economic downturn, as investors anticipate a coming recession. Order of interest rates. The exam may ask you to order 4 important types of interest rates reported in the media, from highest to lowest, or vice versa. Recall that the federal funds rate is the rate at which banks borrow overnight funds from each other. This is the rate that Federal Reserve alters through open market operations. The discount rate is the rate the Fed charges banks to borrow funds from them. The broker call rate is the interest rate that bankers charge broker-dealers to meet their customers' margin requirements. The broker call rate is typically lower than the prime rate, but not as low as the discount or the federal funds rates. The margin rate that the broker charges the customer is typically the broker call rate, plus some additional percentage or fee to compensate the broker for its role and risk. The prime rate is the primary interest rate benchmark for short and medium-term loans in the U.S. The prime rate has historically been the rate that banks charge their most creditworthy customers. A rule of thumb is that the prime rate is usually about 300 basis points, 3%, above the federal funds rate. Order of reported interest rates, from lowest to highest. 1. Federal funds rate, the rate banks charge each other to borrow funds overnight. 2. Discount rate, the rate the Fed charges banks to borrow funds. 3. Broker call rate, the rate at which broker-dealers are allowed to borrow money to fulfill margin requirements. 4. Prime rate, the rate banks charge their best customers to borrow money.